Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Denali training webinar, day one. Today's session will be training on the controller and the general ledger module. So just a little background on this webinar that we've set up here. Normally we do these trainings in person at a local event that we usually do throughout the country. But due to the pandemic, we're going to try to do it using technology today and doing an online training event. So I'm glad you guys are all able to make it today. It's a pleasure to have you on this morning. It's time to go ahead and get started. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So today's training is going to be on the controller, the company setup, and also on the general ledger module as well, where we go over how general ledger accounts are set up specifically for financial reporting and tracking purposes. Okay, so your host today, that's me. My name is Jeremy. I am a trainer here at Cougar Mountain Software. I've been with Cougar Mountain for almost 7 years now. I've been training our clients for the past 7 years on teaching them how to use the Denali program. We've done personal trainings, just one-on-one over the phone, or direct on-site trainings where I actually show up to their business. And then we do these regional trainings as well. But due to the pandemic, we're having to try to do everything over the internet at this point. So bear with us as we try to get everybody covered here in today's session. Our session today is going to be going on for about approximately 2 hours, and we'll try to get all of the topics covered that we have planned for today's session, and also to answer your questions along the way. If I don't get to your questions by the end of the session, then let's go ahead and just send me an email. I'll make sure you all have my email address to send to with any questions that I wasn't able to get to, and I'll be sure to get your questions answered. You can also schedule a one-on-one training appointment with me after today's session at any time. We can get you scheduled in for the next week or two. Okay, so we'll jump right in and get started here. If you want to interact in today's webinar, since we're short on time, the way we do it is we ask that you type in your questions in the webinar questions section. There should be in the webinar dashboard that you have to type in any questions you may have along the way. And I'll try to get those answered as quick as I can throughout the webinar and at the end of the session if I've missed any. There's also an option to raise your hand, and I should be able to see your question. If I miss your question when you've typed it in, use the raise your hand option to try to catch my attention there if needed. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to go through how to set up a company in the controller module. We're just going to kind of go over the basics on that, and how company setup and maintenance is done, security settings, and the basic information on setting up your organization. And then we're going to jump into the general ledger and spend the rest of the class on going over the general ledger module, setting up your chart of accounts and customizing things in your chart of accounts specifically for report purposes. Okay. All right. So with that, we will go ahead and jump right in to the general ledger. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. Okay, very good. Another question is, some of you are asking if there's a way to send out a list of the other attendees that are attending this session today. I don't have access to that right now, but I'll check into that to see if that's going to be an option for us. We'll just have to see if we can do that. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by switching over to the controller, and I'll bring that up on the screen here. And you should now all see the Denali controller module. This is the gateway to the Denali system. This is where you would go in and set up your company when you first set up Denali. But most of you probably already have that set up. So I'm just going to go through and show you the basics on that of how you can set up or edit company information. Now, the first thing you have to do is, in order to do so, you've got to be logged in as the SUP user, and you can see down at the bottom, SUP is the login on that. So you must be logged in as SUP in order to make any changes to the company information. You can set up any other users to go ahead and do anything else in the Denali system, except for that one thing. The SUP is the only one allowed to go in and edit the company information. So when you click on Set Up Your Organization, you see a list of your current company files that you have. And if you need to make any changes, you click this button here to View Modify. And then it opens up that company screen, like the company address, company information, things like that that you can change. If you want to get technical and change some of the system settings, we don't recommend this, but some of those who are technical may be able to come in and do whatever they need to get the Denali company file to work where it needs to, like your server location, things like that. If you need to change that, that's also an option. So when you're setting up a new company, you'll start here as well in the workflow. You can also start in the organization menu at the top, set up select organization. And also on the organization options menu on the left, there is a setup select organization here, define organization information. That's where it starts right there. And all of those options will bring up this option right here to set up a new company. Now, most of you will not see this first option that pops up. The only folks that will see this option is if you have purchased both the fund accounting and the regular business accounting, the non-fund accounting package. So in my situation, I've got both of those here, so that's why I see that option there. And then the system will ask you what you want to do to set up your new company. Just start with a new organization, or are we going to be importing data from QuickBooks into the Denali system? I will say this, if you're going to do an import, make sure that you get our help on that unless you really know what you're doing, because it is quite technical and quite detailed on how the information has to come into Denali. There was an option in the past to just do a conversion from the old Cougar Mountain Professional, that is our old legacy accounting package before Denali, but that has been taken away since we are no longer supporting that package. However, if any of you still need that option, we can still help with that. And then when you click OK, it brings up the organization setup screen where you type in your organization name exactly as you want it to appear on your financial statements and reports. The system will automatically give you a code, which is the first 6 characters of what you type in for the name. The abbreviation, that is the company code used to identify this company in the Denali database. You can change that code if you need to. It doesn't have to be exactly as it typed in there. It can be anything from 1 to 6 characters. Then you just fill out the address. And you notice the shipping address automatically populates as you're filling in the mailing address here. However, you can edit the shipping address afterwards if needed, if that's different than the mailing address. This is like your mailing address, and over here is your street physical location. Most of this information is optional, but it is recommended if you're using purchase order or sales module to make sure that you have the address filled in, and even the telephone number if you want that information to print on sales invoices or purchase orders. Now, since your system is set up, you may not need to go through this process. So we're going to go ahead and cancel this. What happens is the system will create a new database for your company file, and then it will also take you to the next step, which is to install the modules, and you can click Add All to install all of the Denali accounting modules that you have purchased with your package. Or for specific companies, maybe you've got a multiple company setup that does not need all the modules that some of the other companies need. So you can pick and choose which ones you want or which ones you don't want from what you purchased when you're setting up a new company. When that is done, it'll automatically take you to the fiscal calendar setup. So in the workflow, the next step is to set up your preferences for the controller. However, before that can be done, the fiscal calendar would have to be set up first. And you can come in here anytime afterwards, and set up the fiscal calendar or edit the fiscal calendar settings up until you do what we call activate the general ledger, which we'll talk about that a little bit later in this morning's session. So what the fiscal calendar is it's a calendar set up on a period basis. An accounting period is typically a month, and you can have up to 12 periods in the month, but you can also add a 13th period for year-end entries if you'd like. The pros and cons for using the 13th period are, by adding the 13th period, it allows you to, at any point in the future, run year-end financial statements before the year-end adjustments, and then run those same financial statements after the year-end adjustments at year-end closing. So you can kind of do a comparison between the two, how the adjustments have changed what your year-end financials were. So that's one of the advantages of having that 13th period. The drawback of that is the 13th period is just simply the last day of your fiscal calendar, set aside as a separate accounting period. So that means period 12 only goes up to the second to the last day. Period 13 will go up to the last day, basically, and that day has to be set aside for nothing except for year-end adjusting entries. So if you are not able to close your business that day effectively, where you're not allowed to put any regular daily entries in there, you would have to do it that way if you're using that 13th period effectively. If you're not able to do that, then we recommend just going with the 12 periods and put your year-end adjustments on the last day of the 12th period. So you may not get that comparison before and after adjustments by doing that, but most people, all they need is just the final year-end financials after all adjustments anyway, so that should work. Okay, moving on here. The fiscal calendar has 12 or 13 periods per year as described, but you can keep up to 5 years open. So for this week, our session, I've still got last year open, which is where most of my accounting data is from the prior year. So we'll be running all of our training based on last year's information. So for those of us who are very OCD like I am, I hope that doesn't drive you crazy. I know it probably will me. But I can also look at the current year's data. It's just simply periods 14 through 26 in my fiscal calendar, and even going forward. At the end of year 5, if I have not closed out the first year by the end of year 5, at that point, you'll have to do that close so that the calendar will roll forward another year. Every year-end close you do does roll that calendar forward to the next year. If you're using only 12 periods, then the 13th period is skipped every year. Year 2 will still start on period 14, and year 3 will always start on period 27. It just does not use that 13th period every year if you're not using it in the setup. Also, when you're setting up your company, that's where you can decide if you're going to use the 12th or 13th period. And also you decide what your fiscal year start will be every year. So if it's not January 1st, make sure you set that correctly in the initial setup of your company. Once you activate the general ledger, which means now Denali says you're open for business, those settings can no longer be changed on the current company setup. That's why these are grayed out here on mine, because I've already been activated in the general ledger. Okay, so on the fiscal calendar setup, once that's done, then you continue the process of setting up your company, or at any time in the future, you can make any changes going forward to the current company setup, as long as you are an authorized user that's allowed to make those changes. So that brings us to the security. The security in the Denali system is set up for each and every user. I'm going to come back to the preferences here in just a moment, but I'm going to jump into the security first. So when you set up a user in the system, the user will be set up with a password. Now, typically your passwords are optional. So if the user doesn't have a password, that means anyone can log into Denali with that user ID. So be careful with that. Make sure that they get a password if you want to secure your data. And then for each user, you're going to come over here and select which specific functions throughout the Denali system that user is allowed to do or not allowed to do. The functions can be set on the top level, which means this user now has full access to everything. Or you can give the user function full access to each individual module as needed, and not to some of the modules that user may not need. Or if you need to get even more specific, you can open up the list of the functions within that module. These are the menus that you see in the module. For example, if we go to the general ledger here and we open up the list of functions within general ledger, that is just simply the menus here at the top. And if the user does not have access to those menus, the user will not have access to any of the functions under that menu. You could even get more specific within each menu. You can pick and choose which functions under each of those menus that user is allowed to access or not. So that's specifically how you set up your users and your security. You can also set up a segregation of duties in the Denali system using the security settings here. For example here, let's say this user has access to the accounts payable because it's their job to enter the transactions, but before these transactions can be finalized or posted, the supervisor must review this user's work, and then basically by approving that work, the supervisor will do the posting. That's their approval. So that's how you can set a segregation of duties, give one user the rights to enter the bills in accounts payable, for example, and another supervisor to post those bills. And then yet do another user can be set up to pay the bills, basically issuing the checks for the company, and have their supervisor verify those checks before posting. Upon signing the check, the boss will go ahead and say, all right, I signed this stack of checks, they're good for posting, and they'll go ahead and post. So that's the way you can set it up to where you have specific segregation of duties throughout the Denali system from the different users that will secure your accounting and make sure that everybody is doing what they should and things aren't getting lost along the way. And that's entirely up to the setup. Whoever is in charge of setting up security, they can give the users rights to specific functions as needed, or if you're an organization that does not need to be quite that secure, you can go ahead and give users full rights to whatever they need as needed. One thing I always tell everybody when I'm training on how to set up security, though, is I will say this. Whenever you set up a user in the Denali system, make sure that the users don't have full access to the security here in the controller module, the security menu. Basically, they should only have the right to change their own password. You will designate a specific user, maybe 2 or 3, who you know are going to be able to take care of this, the right to reset passwords. But don't give everybody this right, because the reset password function allows the user to reset any other user's password. This option only allows the current user to change their own password, but they're not able to change anyone else's. So that's where you can secure the system, by making sure that in the controller module, each user only has the right to change their own password, but not reset password for others. Now, also, if you are going to change your password as a Denali user, you have to know what the current password is in order to change that. So a good question that just came up from Frank. Thank you, Frank. He says, is there a tracking of the changes that are timestamped or recorded for the user security? The user security does not track the changes made. So this is why it's important to make sure that there's only 1 or 2 trusted people that have access to user security settings. Denali does track most transaction entry. Well, it tracks all transaction entries, as a matter of fact, for financials. And oh, sorry, Michael. Frank is the teammate. Okay. All right. So it does track all transactions that are posted and certain other changes throughout the system, but it does not track these changes on user setup and security with a date timestamp. So keep that in mind when you're setting that up. But in order to change your password as a user, you have to know what your current password is. So if you forget your password, that's where you would go to your supervisor who is authorized to do a reset for you. And that person would have the right to reset password. All right, so little questions there on the Denali security settings. Now, there's some other things we need to talk about, and that's user passwords. By default, the user password can be anything you want it to be, from anywhere from 0 up to, I believe, 20 characters total. You can go with that. You can use letters, numbers, even special characters such as ampersand, $sign, the pound sign, whatever you want to use there for part of the password. However, if you leave the password blank, 0 characters, that means there is no password for that user. So anybody could log in without a password if that's how their setup was done. But if you want it to become even more secure, here in the module preferences, there is an option where you can activate enhanced security login. What that does is that puts requirements on the password, which means that passwords for each user must be a minimum of 8 characters. Passwords must also contain one uppercase, at least one uppercase, at least one lowercase letter, at least one number, and at least one special character as well, such as the ampersand, the percentage, the $sign, any of those special characters. You must have at least one of those characters from all 4 of those categories in the password. Also, with enhanced security login, the system will require a user to reset their password every 90 days. And that automatic reset that occurs every 90 days is not required to be done by their supervisor. They don't have to run to their supervisor and say, okay, I need to reset my password now. They just have to, the system will pop it up for them when they log in after 90 days, but it'll say, your password has expired, please enter a new password, and you'll have to use those enhanced security parameters with the new password. The system will also keep track of previous passwords when you're using enhanced security login, and the user is not allowed to use any password that they have previously used ever since they started using Denali. It always has to be a new password each time. But that is optional. If you don't need to tighten your security that much, you can turn that off in the module preferences in the controller module. Some other options here in the controller module. Some of our longtime Cougar Mountain users like to use the classic navigation. That basically just makes your Denali program look just like your old professional legacy program used to. But any new Denali users, we typically don't recommend that. Even the old-time users, we always recommend leaving these off, because without the classic navigation, or with the classic navigation turned on, then the only thing you're going to see in each module is the drop-down menus at the top and the toolbar here across the top as well. But the rest of the screen is just left blank. There's no left side navigation panel. There's no main navigation panel for the module that you're in. That's what our old legacy software used to look like. So to turn these features on, don't use the classic navigation. You still have the drop-down menus at the top, and you still have the toolbar, just like you would in classic, but you also have additional options for accessing the different functions that you need throughout the Denali system. The left navigation pane can be changed with each one of these options here, and it changes the menu at the top for accessing any of these options. And the main navigation, that cannot be changed. That's just built into the program for the most common functions that you'll be doing within the module itself. Okay. Another question, how do I remove a company if I forgot the password? Well, the problem is you have to have that password to be able to remove a company. And it has to be the SUP password, because remember, you cannot delete or change company information unless you are logged in as the SUP user. The SUP user is the default user for the Denali system that has full access to everything. So definitely you want to put a password on the SUP user, but notice you're not able to change the rights on the SUP user because that is locked down to the full Denali rights that you have. Anything you can do in Denali, you can do with SUP. So what do? If you forgot your SUP password, then hopefully you are a user who has the right to do a reset password. You can go in and reset that SUP password. Excuse me. So that would be the best way to handle that. If you are a user that does not have the rights to reset SUP and no other user is set up that way in your organization, then at that point you would have to give Cougar Mountain customer service a call, and we can help you with that. We can help you with that password reset for the SUP. But make sure when you call into customer service that you are authorized on the account to make those changes. But if you do have the right, under the security menu, you can reset the SUP password. You type in the user, SUP, and you just enter a new password of what you want that to be. When you're resetting any user, you can also require that the next time that specific user logs in, that they will need to change their password from what you put here. They'll have to log in with the password you give them, but then they're going to be required to change that if this box is checked to whatever they want it to be. Or if you leave that unchecked, they can keep the password you give them, and they can still change it if they need, but they don't have to. For SUP, you probably don't need to check that box. There's also an option to set up user groups. What the user groups allows you to do is it basically allows you to assign the same set of rights to an entire group rather than just one specific user. So that way you can set up group policy rights for the different functions throughout your organization. I have a lot of clients that use this for setting up the job functions. Like if somebody comes into their organization as an accounts payable clerk, they've already got the accounts payable clerk group set up. So when that new employee comes in, all they have to do is add them as a user and then just assign them to that group without having to go through each and every one of these specific functions and picking and choosing each individual right for that new employee. You can also copy rights from other users in the system as well. So there's ways you can set up security that make it a little easier for you and simplify the process for all of your new users that are coming into the system. All right. In the Denali system, you also have the option to integrate Denali with certain third-party applications and products that you may be using. That's done in the controller module under the organization menu. And we're going to go into more detail on these particular products when we get to the specific modules that they apply to. But I'll just go through this list real quick and give you a real brief overview and explanation of what these are. So the first one is called TSYS Setup. That used to be Cayenne Setup. Cayenne and TSYS, they changed their name to TSYS. They are a credit card merchant processor. So if you accept credit cards, you can set up a merchant account with TSYS. And they're supposed to have really good rates and all that. So you can check into that to see what they offer. But if you do, then your credit card transactions can be directly integrated into the Denali sales module. so that when you're processing credit cards, the Denali system itself can capture that credit card information for that transaction and transmit that through your merchant processor through TSYS to verify and charge the customer's credit card for that sale. So you don't have to have a separate credit card machine where you swipe the card or punch in the number manually. In Denali, the TSYS system, it does come with a device that connects to your point of sale or your sales computer that the customer can actually swipe their card, just like you see in the grocery store, and there's a screen for them to sign it or enter their PIN number. The device is fully compatible with the new chip cards as well. Or you can type in the credit card number if you're doing like a phone sale right within the Denali system. You click on the credit card as the payment type for that sale, and it pops up the screen to enter the credit card information right within the system. It's not required to have this particular integration to accept credit cards, but it is required if you want that credit card processing to be directly integrated into Denali sales module. The next one is Neon CRM setup. Neon is a customer resource management system that is specifically designed for nonprofit organizations, where you can set up a website for your donors that are contributing to your organization to give you, or for donors to log into and make their contributions. And those contributions can then be directly imported into the Denali system with the integration here. Denali is another donor portal that you can use. So these are two different donor portals that you can use that can be integrated into the Denali system. But if you're going to use those, it does require the Denali Fund application, not the Denali Business application for either of these two portals. The Yodlee integration, that is an integration that you can set up through an organization that will have a direct link to your bank. And that simplifies your bank reconciliation. It allows you to reconcile your bank statements in Denali and have those cleared transactions automatically marked as cleared as they clear your bank. So when you're reconciling, it will automatically import the cleared transactions for you, so you don't have to manually go through each and every one on the bank statement to mark it cleared. PayPal integration works directly with accounts receivable for payment collection and customer billing. The electronic constants, that's not a third-party product, actually. That is just a setup for setting up Denali accounts payable to transmit 1099 forms directly to the IRS electronically, if that's required because you have more than so many, or if it's optional. If you don't have to do it, you can still set it up and do it anyway. But you would need to set up with the IRS for that function. And the last option here in the organization is your internal control alerts. So that'll be the next thing we cover in the session today. What you do here is you just simply set up your email server so that Denali can access that server directly for sending out email alerts to the various people within your organization that need to receive those alerts. So what are internal control alerts? Internal control alerts are specifically set up to notify, like supervisors, for when users are doing certain things. Remember, we talked about the segregation of duties. So if I have my accounts payable clerk entering bills, but they can't post the bill because the supervisor needs to be notified that those bills are now ready to be posted in that user's batch. You can set up Denali to send out that email address when that time comes, when the user says, okay, I've got this batch ready to go, so let's go ahead and send out the alert so my supervisor receives that alert and he can then log in and approve that batch and go ahead and post it. It's also very handy if you use purchase order. Purchase order has a feature called requisitions, where you can enter a requisition, but the requisition does not become an actual purchase order until it has been approved. And so therefore, the supervisor or the approver receives the alert with the internal control alert function that there are requisitions waiting for approval. And we'll talk about that more specifically when we do the purchase order training later this week. So what you're setting up here is just simply the parameters that Denali needs to access your email server to send out those internal control alerts. Question about Yodlee integration. The question says, is Yodlee an additional module or software? Yodlee is included with the bank reconciliation module. So if you don't have the bank reconciliation module as part of your package, your Yodlee integration is not necessary. There's no need to set it up because it won't have any function without the bank reconciliation module. But it will be included if you have the bank rec module. There's no additional charge for that or additional service you have to sign up for. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover in the controller module is securing your company data. When and where to do a backup and when to do a restore, and also the steps that you want to take prior to doing a restore. So to do a backup, it's real simple in Denali. You just click this button here, Backup Organization Information, in the controller. That's where you would do that. You can also do a backup under the Options menu using the backup option here. And also the Resources and Tools menu, the option to do a backup is done here as well by clicking this option here. So the question comes up, is there a way to automate your backups? There is a way to automate backups, but it's not included with the Denali program itself. In order to automate your backups, what you want to do is make sure that the server where your Denali data is being saved has been set up to have an automatic backup in place on that server itself. And there's several options for that. You can do your own internal scheduling for that using the server utilities on that server, or you can sign up for a service that does an external backup for you, where the server itself is backed up to an external location on the cloud, and therefore it's the most secure in case anything does happen to your organization. So if you don't have automatic backups done, then you will want to do a backup here on occasion, at least weekly. Some people do it daily just to make sure that they have a current restore point every day that they can fall back on if needed. And there's nothing wrong with doing it daily. It's absolutely fine. There's no need to limit the number of backups that you can do. You can do as many as you need to. Also, one of the advantages of Denali is because it is an SQL server-based data platform, then you don't have to have everybody sign out of Denali in order to run your backup. You can have the backup going while other users are in the backup itself. So, or other users are in Denali itself. So there's no need to keep it going there. Or there's no need to kick everybody out to run your backup. That's what I meant to say there. And to do a backup, you just simply click here. The system will give you a default location, which is by design. The default location is on the C drive of the current workstation that is logged in, or of the user that is making the backup. And it is on the C drive in the Program Files Cougar Mountain Software folder under the Denali folder there. But underneath that folder, there's another folder created for the company code that you're currently logged into. Under that, you have another folder called Backup because there's going to be other items in that company folder as well for your company. And then there's one final path, one final folder under Backup that's got some numbers there. And if you look closely, I don't know if you can see it very well on your screen, but if you look closely, those numbers are just simply the date and time that the backup was initiated. So 2020 is the year, 0720 is the date, 1142 is the time. That's what time it is here at my place. I'm a mountain time zone. So if it's afternoon, it'll be, if it's Eastern time, that would say 1342 if it was 1:42 p.m. However, you can change the location of where that backup is saved just by clicking this button and browsing an alternate location. But the advantage of going with this location is if you're using a workstation server environment where the workstation is not the same machine as the server, then the backups are saved on the workstation running the backup. So if the server ever crashes, the workstation has all that backup, all those backups. And you can have multiple workstations. Just assign that to 2 or 3 different users on their workstations to run a backup on occasion, so that if one of the workstations crash, the system has a backup on one of the other workstations instead. And they're all date time stamped, as you can see, so you see exactly the date and time that the backup was created. I recommend starting your backups in the morning when you first come in if you want to run a backup daily. Because like I said, you can have anyone in the system using the system while the backup is running. So you get the backup going and then you go about your work while it's going, and there's no problem with that. Backups are safe. It doesn't hurt anything to do a backup. All it's doing is copying the data into a backup file. But be very careful with a restore. When you do a restore, then you've got to be careful not to accidentally restore over the current company file, because when you do a restore, you pick your date timestamp, and look, here's one from clear back in 2018. If I was to go ahead and do a restore here and click OK, it would override my current data with this old 2-year-old data. So that means I've just lost everything for the past 2 years that I've posted in the system. So my recommendation is when you're setting up user rights, do not give everybody the right to restore. Only pick a select few people that you know will do it properly. And then then they can go ahead and do a restore. And even then, make sure you follow steps when doing a restore. The first step is, before you restore a previous backup, make a current backup first, just in case you accidentally restore too far back and then you've lost everything. Make a current backup first, and then when you do the restore, if it's not what you wanted to do, at least you could restore the last current backup you did to put you back where you were. And there's a good question. Does the backup and restore apply for us if we are using the cloud-based Cougar Mountain system? The cloud-based system that you're using with Cougar Mountain, either through SEM Technologies, which is the Freedom Cloud, or the new cloud-based system we just set up recently, the systems are constantly backed up automatically. So there's no need to run a backup every day just to secure the data. That being said, though, you still want to run a backup regardless. Even if you have a fully automated system set up, you still want to run a backup before doing any function in Denali that's like a major function, such as a year-end close or purging old history, things like that. Make sure you run a backup before doing anything like that. That way, if you need to revert back to prior to that year-end close or purging that old history, you've got that backup copy you can always revert back to if needed. So running a backup, just click the button. It's real simple. But if your backups are automated through a cloud-based system like SendTech, or if you have an automatic backup set up on the server, you probably don't need to do it every day. Just do it before running each of those major functions as you're working on the system. But to do a restore, the steps you want to take are, first, do a backup of the current data, and then you can do your restore. And then after you've done the restore, just check certain things like your financial reports and general ledger, customer history, and accounts receivable, and just see if that's where you want it to be. That's the final step, just to confirm that that's what you wanted to restore. If it's not, you can restore a different backup. Worst case scenario, you could at least restore the one you did right before the first restore, so that you don't lose your current data at least. Okay, so that is the controller module in a nutshell. The specifics on how to set up your company and some of the maintenance tasks in setting up the company as well. Questions? Looks like there is a question here. It says, is the training session being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded. So if you're not able to stay for the full session today, we will make it available to anyone who has registered for today's session. We will make that available for you to download the recording to watch at a later time. Okay, another question. Is it possible to see the group questions coming in? Sometimes it's helpful to spark further questions. That's a good point. When you're asking a question in the webinar, there should be an option to send that question just to the host, which is me, or to send it to all users as well. So make sure you hit the right button when you're asking questions if you want to, but it's up to the person asking the question whether they want the rest of you to see that or not. So, and I'm trying to get to them all and saying those out loud on the recording today. So hopefully I won't miss any. Another question just came in. For Yodely, do all banks allow this integration for bank statements? Most banks throughout the US and Canada do allow it, but there have been one or two, there's been issues with their online banking logins that have made it difficult or not possible to use the Yodely integration. So if you do run into those difficulties, you may not have that option in the bank reconciliation module. And I'll go into more details on that when we get to the bank rec training. And then the next question, does the bank charge for integration? Typically it does not, because it's just included with online banking. So Yodely just uses your online banking credentials with your bank in order to give access to Denali to download those transactions for reconciliation. Okay, so any other questions about the controller module before we move on to general ledger? Another question, will Yodely work if there is more than one bank account? That is a great question. The answer is absolutely. You can set up as many bank accounts through Yodely in Denali that you need to set up the automatic reconciliation for. So that's absolutely fine as well. All right. All right, a couple more questions came in. Custom menus. Yes, Frank, thank you for reminding me that, or that's Stephen. I did get your email on that. So very good question. How do you set up custom menus in the Denali system? Well, that's done under the module preferences here in the controller. Every module will have a custom menu option if you have set that up in the custom options here. So the first thing you're going to do for each item you want to add to the custom menu is first you're going to select which module you want to add that to. Then you're going to enter a category or leave it none. That's optional. But you need to enter an item name. An item name is how it's going to be listed in the drop-down menu from the top. And so you can enter anything you want to be listed in that custom menu. Then you're going to select what is that custom item? What is it for? Is it a file you want to launch when you click on it from the menu? Is it just a program you want to launch and then you'll open the files within the program? It's entirely up to you what you want to include. Any document or program can be selected here as basically as the custom option. It can be PDF documents, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, even Crystal report forms that are customized to run specifically in the Crystal program. They can be set up here as well to be a custom menu option in the other modules. You can also enter a website here instead of a file. But if you enter a website, make sure you check this box here. That means that it's a website link is what that custom menu is. Instead of a document, it's just a website. If it's not a website, then you can publish it to the server to give all Denali users the same options when they click on that link, that custom menu option. If it is a website, then they'll all have those options automatically by default. Unless you take those away from them in their security settings. You do have that option to not allow them to run those custom options in the security settings. And you can set up as many custom options that you need to set up in the system here for whatever modules they're for. You can set up multiple options for general ledger, and then just keep adding to the lines here for the other modules as needed. And those options will be there. And the other question is prepare for electronic transmissions. We did go over that briefly. I actually went over that up here, the electronic constants. That's the same option as here. That's just to set up the accounts payable for transmitting 1099 forms to the IRS. That's all that's for. So if you do set that up, you'll have to make sure that your information is entered correctly from what the IRS says here. Have you put whatever the IRS gives you that needs to be filled out for this particular, for your software to transmit 1099 forms to them. That's what you're going to need to fill out here. Okay, great questions, guys. Thank you. Now, excellent question, Rachel. She's asking, in the custom module, can you set up a link to the website to make federal tax payments and set that up as a custom option in the payroll module? Absolutely, yes. You just set that up and put in the link there, and it'll go right there. So that is correct. Okay. So to get to the other accounting modules, you just click on the buttons at the top of the screen here. And you click on the GL button, that launches the general ledger module. So now I've got the general ledger open here. And if I had set up any custom options for general ledger, on the other side of the help, there's one more option you would see appear here called custom options. And when you click on that, it brings a drop-down list, just like these other options do. But the items in that drop-down are the specific custom options you have set up for this module in the Denali system. So that's a great lead into the general ledger. Now, for me, I haven't set up any custom module options, so I don't see that option here. And then when you click on a custom option, it's doing the same thing as if you click on one of the other options. It just launches the specific thing you have set up for that. Or it goes to the website if it's a link, a URL link. Okay. General ledger. So here's the part that's really fun for those of you who are accountants, but those of you who are not actual accountants or CPAs, the rest of today's class, hopefully I'll try to keep it exciting, but it might get kind of boring for you, so bear with me. Feel free to ask your questions along the way as well. So, all right. So for the general ledger, this is where you set up your company's chart of accounts. And in Denali, those chart of accounts, like most accounting systems, are used specifically for financial reporting and financial tracking. And you set up the main types of accounts. Normally, when I do a class at one of our regional locations, I actually take the time here to go through what I call my 4-year accounting degree in 30 minutes. But we don't have that much time for this session. So for those of you who need a little more accounting training, then I always tell you to refer to your accountant or CPA for your organization. They can help you with any questions about that. Or for just general questions on accounting that aren't specific to your organization, I'm even able to answer some of those as I am an accountant. So if you do have any questions, I can answer general questions. But I am not a CPA, so I have to throw that disclaimer out there to everyone in this class. I am not legally authorized to give you accounting advice specific for your organization. So keep that in mind when you're asking me your questions. If it's something that I can't give you advice on, I'll refer you to your CPA for those answers. But a general chart of account structure, I can go over how that works in an accounting system for you. But the specifics for your organization are going to have to be determined by your CPA or your accountant. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started on the general ledger. The first thing we look at is the module preferences, which can also be accessed through the options menu here, or through the little gearbox link here, set up preferences. So the module preference is set up here. And a good question, how many budgets can I define in GL? Remind me of that question again when we get to the budgeting, and I'll answer that for you. Quick answer is there's no limit to that. You can set up as many as you need to. So for your general ledger module preferences, this is where you set up the general settings of how general ledger is going to function in your organization. Now, if you don't have the fund accounting suite, these options are a little different. If you're using the business accounting suite, it's going to look like this instead. Not quite as many options as you see in fund accounting. Little different. But in fund accounting, we have functionality that's specifically tracked by fund itself, not just for the whole general ledger. So it's like you're setting up a chart of accounts, but each fund has an independent chart of accounts that are all brought together for the overall organization chart of accounts as well. And we'll go over that in the fund and account setup here. So you set the basic settings of how you want your module to function. Over here, though, the account segment setup, this is the critical setup on how you want your financial reports to work in the general ledger. It's all based on your chart of accounts structure in Denali. So most people have a simple structure, like in business accounting. It's extremely simple on my end. I have a simple 4-digit account number for each of my GL accounts. And they're all listed out on my financial reports, such as the balance sheet, the income statement, or the budget reports. Those accounts are listed out based on the chart of account structure that I've set up and how those accounts are set up in there. But if you want more advanced reporting features, like the ability to run reports for different parts of your organization, such as departmental financial statements or divisional financial statements that are all part of the overall organization, but you need to show a profit and loss statement for a specific part of your organization, then you would structure your chart of accounts to be a little more complex than that by adding what's called another segment. So if I added another segment and call it a location, now I've got a 6-digit account number. The first 4 digits is still my chart of accounts numbers, assets, liabilities, income and expenses, and so forth. But then each account has a 2-digit code added to the end, which means the same account can be set up multiple times for the different locations. And by doing so, I can run a profit and loss specific for one location, rather than just an overall profit and loss, not knowing how much of it goes where in my organization. It's just one general profit and loss for the overall. But by setting up your chart of account structure here, this is where your reporting is going to really come into play. And this is still a pretty simple setup that gives you those additional options. And that's done through the account segment setup in the chart of accounts. And with Denali, you can get as complex as you need to. You can go all the way up to 6 different segments for reporting. You may have a location. You may have a department in addition to a location. You may have a sub-account in addition to those options. So you can go up to 6 segments when setting up the chart of accounts here. You can also go up to 50 digits total across all segments. So if I only have one segment, I could do a 50-digit account number here, and it would be a great big string of numbers all in one big segment. Or I could break it up into multiple segments as long as the total does not equal 50. So I can do, or does not go over 50. So I can do for my second segment, I can do 6 digits. My third segment, I can do 12 digits. My fourth segment, I can do 8. So now I'm getting a real complex structure here with these big, long, elaborate account numbers. So the issue is, though, I always tell everybody when you're setting up your chart of account structure here, always start small. Start very small as you can get away with to get started in the Denali system, but still give you the full reporting capabilities you need. And the reason for that is because you can always expand on it at any time in the future. For example, I have one segment with 4 digits. If I want to expand on that at any time, I simply adjust the account segments. I can increase my one segment to 5, 6, or 7, or however many digits up to 50, or I can add additional segments at this point. But always start small because you cannot go back. You cannot decrease the digits or decrease the number of segments. Once they're added, they're locked in. So keep that in mind as well. Also, a good question, you cannot change the order of your segments once you've set them up here. When you're adding a new segment, it can be added anywhere in the structure you want. Let's say you've already got 3 segments. I want to add a 4th segment, but I want that to be my 2nd segment and move my 2nd to the 3rd, my 3rd to the 4th. You can do that, but once you click OK, that's locked in. You can't take it away. You can only add. So keep that in mind as you're doing that. That's a great question. Some other questions came in while I was discussing the account segments. Does every account number require a location segment? Good question. If you add another segment, whether it's a location, a division, whatever you want to call that segment, it's up to you. The current structure is going to add the segment to the end here, or wherever you insert it, if it's a middle segment. It's going to add that in, and it's going to be added to all the existing accounts, but it'll just be added with zeros to the existing accounts. So at that point, you can start setting up new accounts by location going forward. But it doesn't just automatically add a specific location number to the existing accounts. It'll just put the zeros there for however many digits you have. So that is a great question. So it says, can you specify order when setting up the segments? That is a great question. Specifically, they're asking about the fund, whether it can be first or last. That is a great question, and I'm going to go into that a little more detailed on the fund accounting. What we're looking at here is the business accounting. It's not fund. So, and it says, can you combine segments for a condensed reporting? Yes, you can actually with the advanced report group setup, which we're going to go over that in today's class as well. So a few more questions here that came in. Try to get to those real quick. Let's see here. What does multi-batch mean? Good question. I'm going to specifically cover that. Actually, that is right here. So one of the options is activate multi-batch mode. Multi-batch mode is specifically designed for multiple users that are doing the exact same function in Denali when you're entering transactions. So that is very important. If you need to have, in general ledger, the only thing you do is journal entries, enter, edit journal activity. So if you have to have multiple users entering journal entries at the same time, you will need multi-batch mode for that to occur. Each user will be working in their own batch. And then when you go to enter a journal entry, it'll ask you to either set up a batch or select the current batch that is currently open in the system. In this case, I have batches open, so it's asking me to select a batch. But if I need to create a new batch, because I'm a user coming in for today's transactions, and I don't want to go into someone else's batch, I'll just create new. And it'll automatically identify the batch by the user ID and the time of day, but you can edit the identity as needed. And then when you go into that batch, you can start making your journal entries. You just fill out your transactions. And you can do as many transactions in a batch as needed. Well, there is a limit up to 9,999. And at the end of your session, you verify accuracy. We call that the edit report, and then you post. But it only posts the current batch that you're in. And down here is your batch number that you're currently in. It doesn't post everybody else's batches. The batch numbers are not allowed to be changed when you go into a batch setup. To switch to a different batch that's open, you can go to the batch control, but these numbers cannot be changed. That is a numbering system designed by the system that you're not allowed to change, and it's all letters. It's a 6-digit number that's actually just all letters. So that is the question there. when you're setting up a new batch, it'll always give you the next one in the number, but you can change the identity as needed. That batch control applies to all modules, but you can set up multi-batch or single batch within each module separately. It doesn't have to be for the entire system. So a couple more questions about segment setup. Can you change the length of the segments after you start using your chart of accounts? Yes, like I say, it'll just add a 0 for the new digits you're adding for the existing accounts that you already have set up. And then the other question, when you're changing from 4 to 6 digits with a new segment, the system adds NN to the front of the XX, or do you need to specify where to add it? Yes, that is a good question. What it does is it will put it to the end when you add 2 more digits. Let's say I put in 2 more digits here. It'll put it on the end. The NN just tells you those are new digits. But if I want to put those in front of the account instead, I just replace the X's in the front with an N and an N like that. Now it's going to put those new zeros in front instead of at the end. And question says, if you decrease the length of, how does it determine which to remove? So if you missed it, I had explained you can only increase, you cannot decrease. I cannot go down to 3 digits. If I try to do that here, it's not going to let me because it can't remove what you've already set up. So if I enter 3, it's going to say, nope, can't do that. You have to go with 4. If I was to click OK, it would just say, nope. Your adjusted length does not match the original account. You need to modify your segment settings to the account length, which is at least 4 characters to continue. So it'll tell you that if you try to adjust it to a lower segment rather than an upper, rather than increasing. Okay, so your preferences is all about the account segment structure. Now you notice too, when I added another segment here, I didn't save my changes, but when I added another segment, the system asked me, what do I want to call that segment? In business accounting, there's a predefined label called account, but the other labels, you can do up to 5 additional labels that are user-defined labels. And so if I add it here, I say there's going to be 2 digits there, then that's how it's going to put the system in place there. However, to put those predefined labels in place, that's where you go to the previous option, name user-defined segment labels. This is where you can put in those labels here. And that's how that works in the general ledger. And you can change these labels at any time. Once these labels are set, you can come in here and edit these at any time, as long as you're a user with security rights to access the module preferences in general ledger. Now, let's look at the segment structure of fund accounting for a moment. For those of you who use fund accounting, then Denali requires that your account structure be a minimum of 2 segments. The digits within each segment can be whatever you want, like we saw in business accounting, but you must have at least 2 segments. You can still do up to 6, but you must have at least 2. And the reason why is because one of those segments is your fund segment for tracking the different funds in your organization. That is required for the fund accounting system to work. Now, when you're first setting up your organization, you can set that fund segment as the first segment or as the last segment. The first segment, it's a prefix. The last one, it's a suffix. But once you activate general ledger, that is one segment you cannot move to the prefix or suffix. You can't relabel the fund segment as the prefix or the suffix, which is why it's grayed out here. On mine, I've set it as the suffix, and I'm not allowed to change it at this point because I've already activated general ledger. But I can still increase the number of segments or increase the digits for each segment as needed, including the fund. I can even increase the digits on my fund segment, but the fund segment only is limited to 6 characters. You cannot go more than 6 characters on the fund. Any other segments, you can go as many as you want, as long as all segments combined do not exceed the 50-character limit. But in here, I can still add another segment, and I can add additional characters as needed. Like I can do 3 here, put it there. And it will put that segment here, not at the very end, because my fund is the last segment. I can't change that. It always puts it at the end unless your fund is the last segment, then it puts it right before the fund. That's how that's going to work. If I do 2, I can put it there. And then what I can do, though, is I can put the new numbers here. Oh, nope, it doesn't let you do that. Sorry. You're limited. The segments will always go at the end. In business accounting, they'll always go at the end. But if you're increasing the digits within a segment, you can put those new digits wherever you want them to go. Okay. So that is the setup of the general ledger module itself and the chart of account structure. But remember this structure here, I'm in fund accounting with 3 segments. This is what it's all about. I've got my first segment I have is my account number, just like business accounting. My last segment is my fund, but then I've got one here I call a program. Some people, the fund is the program in some organizations, so you might not need a separate segment for that. But I've dealt with clients where the fund could actually be funding multiple different programs. Or on the other hand, the program may be receiving funds from multiple funds for the same program. So you have to track those 2 separately if needed. And then when you run your financial reports, let's say I want to run a revenue and expense report, I can choose a specific fund. In business accounting, you won't have the fund option, but you will still have the account filter. The account filter is where the magic happens based on the chart of account structure there. Remember here, the first is my account number, the second segment is my program, and the last segment is my fund. So let's say I have a program 01. Program 01. I want to see a revenue and expense report for all of the program 01's revenues and expenses. And I'll tell the system to print the account number to illustrate what that looks like based on the account filter here. So instead of getting an entire revenue and expense for the whole organization, all I'm going to see here is the revenues and expenses for one program. And I'll run it for the entire year so you can see some activity there. When I click OK, I'm going to go to the screen. Now my system's going to pop this up on my other screen, so I need to pull it over here when it does. It's generating that report now. It does run a little slower when I'm doing a webinar, so bear with me here. I have to confess, I'm actually working from home because of the COVID pandemic. So we're trying to keep this going here and with the limited resources we have. So, but sometimes it can take it a little longer to run things. But what you'll see is you're going to see all the revenues and all the expenses here on this revenue and expense report for the entire year, but only for my 01 program. All right, my report finally popped up. And notice there's not a whole lot in my 01 program. I'll zoom that in here so you can see it a little better. I've only got one revenue line, government matches, that has any activity for the year for my 01 program. And I only have 3 expense lines that have activity. But you notice every line is designated with that 01 for the different revenue and expense accounts, even across different funds. You probably noticed that my funds are alpha characters as well. That's optional. You can use alpha characters in your chart of account structure if you want. It's not required, but it is optional as needed. But so there's the total for the entire year. Here's my total revenue for my 01 program, total expenses, and this is what I have as excess revenue over expenses, bottom line right there. In business accounting, you can run the profit and loss report for a specific division or location using that account filter. using the same thing here. And then you see the total net income or profit for that one division or one location, your 0-1 division, or however you've numbered it. That is the key in setting up your chart of accounts. So you want to make sure that your chart of account structure is set up specifically for these reporting options. That's what it's all about. Okay. So once you've established the chart of account structure, then you're going to set up your funds is the next step in the general ledger setup. So the fund segment, remember we have one of our segments set up for funds. Now, for those of you who don't have fund accounting, you can skip this part. And before I go into this, let me get to these questions here. Is there a way to combine expenses to the account fees on your report? So good question. So instead of filtering out one program or one division, can we get a combined report with all the different programs and divisions in a single report showing on for the organization for each expense or each revenue? Yes, there is an option for that. It's the advanced report groups, and I will make sure we get to that when we get to the advanced reports to show you that. For management, the detail of accounts is needed. It's part of the same question. So I'll go through a general overview of how to set that up. If you need more specifics on setting that up that you're not able to get with this session just because of our time, then definitely send me an email and I can get with you to give you a more specific focused training on for your organization how to set that up. All right, so once we set up our module preferences, we now have a fund segment. My situation, the fund is 4 characters. So then you're going to go back and set up your funds in fund accounting. In business accounting, you don't worry about this step here. This isn't even an option in the business accounting suite. And in mine, each fund must be 4 characters in length. 4 digits is the fund number. But like I said, you can use alpha characters if you'd like. So I'm using alpha characters in mine. ADMN is my administration fund. The fund setup also includes a fund transfer type. By default, it's going to be set to restricted when you're setting up a new fund. The other option is unrestricted, and then there's one option in between called due to, due from. If you set this up as a restricted fund, that means every time you hit any GL account with this fund as part of the account number, in the general ledger, you must have a debit and a credit for every transaction, and they have to equal. Debits and credits have to equal. But in fund accounting, if you restrict the fund, it's more specific than that. Not only do your debits and credits have to equal, but they also have to equal within that fund. It's a restricted fund. So if I debit an expense account for the administration fund and credit the cash account to pay for an expense, the cash must also come out of the administration fund. It cannot come from a different fund because it's restricted. Denali doesn't allow that on restricted funds. And when you're entering expenses in accounts payable, it'll automate that for you. Any checks you issue out of AP for whatever expenses, the cash side of those entries will automatically be deducted from that fund's cash only. It does not pull it from another fund because it's restricted. Same with revenues, through the receivables or just entering in bank deposits for revenues coming in. When you code those revenues to a revenue line in the general ledger, the line will include a fund. If it's a restricted fund, the cash for that revenue must go into a cash account that's also set up for that fund as an asset. And that way the fund is restricted and it will ensure that the funds are balanced. The unrestricted option, that allows you to debit one fund's account while at the same time crediting another funds account in a journal entry. But it only lets you do it in a journal entry, and that's also only allowed if you have checked the option in the module preferences to allow unbalanced funds. So if you don't need to keep your funds in balance, you can set them as unrestricted here as the fund transfer type. So the question comes up, well, wait a minute, what if my funds are not restricted, but I still need to keep them balanced? What do I do about that? Well, that's where the do to, do from come into play. So with do to, do from, when you debit one funds account and credit another funds account in the same transaction, Denali will allow that, but it will also automatically for you put in an opposing do to and do from entry across the two different funds that you're crossing, so that you're not restricting the fund, but you're still keeping the fund balanced. And that'll happen automatically. So if you're setting up your funds as do to, do from, which is the recommended setup for all funds that are not restricted, using the do to, do from keeps everything balanced, but still lets you cross funds as needed. Then when you're setting that up, you have to establish a do to and a do from account for each fund that is set up as a do to, do from fund. The do to and the do from can be the same account for the fund, or as you see in my setup, it's two different accounts. If it's two different accounts, you'll make the do to typically a liability account, and the do from is typically an asset account. If it's the same account, it's typically just an asset account for the one account, and it would just be set up like this. So they're both the same account on the fund setup. Question, can I change the do to, do froms after the funds have been started? You can, but if you do, make sure that that fund's do to and do from accounts have a zero balance at the time you change those. Otherwise, you're going to be left something hanging out that won't ever resolve itself with the do to, do from. So that's the recommended setup on that. Zero out those do to and do from balances on any fund before you change that fund's do to, do from account. Another question is, can we change to restricted and not use the do to, do from at any time? Yes, at any time you can restrict a fund, even if it was priorly set up as a do to, do from, or even unrestricted. You can change that to restricted at any time. When you change it to restricted, there is an option to put in a date that it will be released from restricted status, but that's not required. You can leave that out if you don't need to put that just restricted to a certain date. But again, if you're going to change from do to, do from to restricted or even to unrestricted, make sure that the do to and do from accounts in that fund have been resolved somehow so that they're not left hanging out there. And if you do need to leave a do to or a do from on each fund that you're going to run manually, then that's okay. You can leave those accounts there with the balance in them. But at some point, you know, your financial statements, they're going to have to be resolved at some point. Otherwise, they're going to keep showing up every year as a do to or a do from on that specific fund, rather than having it zeroed out. The other accounts that funds require, the reserve for encumbrance account is entirely optional. It's only used if you're using the encumbrance features in fund accounting. Whereas when you put in a purchase order through the PO module, then those expenses are encumbered even before you receive the vendor invoice, which means they're not actual expenses yet, but they're already going against your budget. They're encumbered expenses. That's what the reserved for encumbrance account. This is just the default account that's used for those reserved amounts. The unreserved for encumbrance, that is the year-end closing for fund accounting. Whenever you close out your fund at the end of the year, all excess revenue is posted to the unreserved for encumbrance account. Or if it's a loss, if you have a deficit, it's a debit posting to the unreserved. In the business world, they call that retained earnings. But in fund accounting, you can't have retained earnings because that means you have income. And fund accounting is nonprofit for nonprofit or government organizations. So any leftover money at the end has to be encumbered to be used for the organization's causes or for the government organization's purposes. It cannot be issued out to stockholders as dividends. That's not an option in nonprofit fund accounting. It has to be encumbered, but it's not reserved for anything specifically unless you have reserved it through other entries. So therefore, it's posted as an unreserved, but it's still an encumbrance. That's your year-end posting in fund accounting. You also have a separate account called the retained fund balance, which if you want to use the same account for that, like you can set that up so it's the same account either way. But you can also have a separate account for the retained fund balance. And the reason why that can be separate is you may have excess revenue that you don't want to retain. You're going to leave it in the unreserved encumbrance to be used in the following year, or you can transfer it to a separate retained fund balance account to be retained for other purposes, using a journal entry to make that transfer. So that's the reason why there's two options there. It's just an additional function in fund accounting that you have. Again, if you're business accounting, you don't use fund accounting, none of this applies. None of this applies at all. So you will set up a retained earnings account in your business, but that's the only thing you'll have to worry about. There's no such thing as due to, due from, and all that in business accounting typically. All right. So that is your fund setup when you're setting up your funds. And in Denali, you can set up as many different funds as you need, but keep in mind, each fund you set up has to have a complete full set of accounts in the chart of accounts list. So the more funds you have, the more complex your chart of accounts structure is going to be for your overall organization. But that's fine. If that's what you need, Denali is perfectly capable of handling that. So that brings us to the chart of accounts setup itself here. So with the chart of accounts, you can do the setup through the account maintenance here, or we have a button for that on the main task. And of course, over on the left side, the chart of accounts menu, you can set it up here by clicking this option. These left menu options are a double click if you need to open those. It's a double click, and then you see that option pop up. All the other options in Denali, either here or through the dropdown, are single click options on these navigation menus. And there's your chart of accounts set up right there. So your chart of accounts, when you're setting up the accounts, you're going to set up the account number, but it's going to be all segments of the account. So you're going to add the account number, the program, and the fund. At any point, if a specific segment doesn't apply, you'll just type zeros in that segment for that particular segment, because it's still required to have it there. You can't leave it blank. It has to be there for the reporting. If you're using fund accounting, the fund will designate the fund number, the fund description, and the fund calendar, the fiscal calendar for the fund. Then you come down here and you put the description for the account itself. This is the line item on the financial statement that this account applies to. That's what prints on your financial reports. Whatever you put here is the description for your chart of accounts setup. Then you're going to select your account class, asset, liability, revenue, expenses, or net asset. Net asset. So for those of you who are not fund accounting experts, what is a net asset? Well, a net asset is the same thing as equity in a business accounting setup. In business accounting, they call that an equity. But in fund accounting, it's a net asset. So if I bring up my chart of accounts and come down here to some of my net asset accounts, you kind of get some examples of how those are. So we've got endowments that are net asset balances, net fund balances, unreserved fund balances, and then just the general fund balance that we talked about itself. Those are called net assets in the fund accounting world, which is the same as equity in the business accounting world. And when you run your balance sheet, that's exactly what it says on the balance sheet. It says it's a net asset. not a equity. It doesn't list it as equity. So I'll run a balance sheet for the administration fund to illustrate that there for you. You also have revenues and expenses in fund accounting. In Denali's business accounting, you have income and expenses. A similar, but they work the same as well. So that one ran a little bit better. So there's my assets, total assets. There's the liabilities. And then there's my net assets. Total liabilities and net worth is the same as my total assets. So I'm in balance in the administration fund. Okay. Also, when you're setting up your chart of accounts, it is very important. Make sure that you set a report group 1 for every account you set up in the general ledger. That way you have the full reporting capabilities. If you don't set up that group 1, you're only going to be able to run basic reports, just the basic balance sheet or the basic income statement or basic revenue and expense. This applies to all Denali users that use general ledger, not just fund accounting, business accounting as well. Make sure every account has the group 1 set up here. Don't leave that out. If you leave that out on even one single account, when you try to run those advanced reports, you get an error. It says, I don't know what to report on here because at least one of your accounts is missing that group 1 setting. So make sure they're all set up correctly. If you're using the cash flow statement, make sure your assets and liabilities have a group 2 setting. That is only used for the cash flow statement, but it's not as critical because you can still run a cash flow without it. It just might not reconcile the way it should unless the assets and liabilities have that setting set up correctly. The group 3 setting, that is an optional setting that you can set up your own custom groups, but it is only used in the database for exporting. Denali reports that are built in do not use the group 3 at all. So that is only used for exporting. Okay. And it looks like it's continuing so far. All right, we're still on. Very good. Just want to make sure. I haven't used this GoToWebinar feature. It's a new one that was added for the timer, I guess. So I'm glad we're still on. All right, we had it scheduled for 2 hours, but I started the webinar about 20 minutes early just to make sure we got all the technical difficulties worked out. Okay, question on journal entries. If cash goes to a bank account, then our revenues by LOC segment 2, yet revenue is to a specific location, segment 2. All right, so yeah, that's a good question. Basically what you're asking is, how does the system keep things balanced? The only way it keeps stuff balanced is either on the account, the whole chart of accounts, or if your funds are set as restricted or due to, due from, it will keep the funds balanced. But all your other segments are not going to stay balanced, but you don't really need them to be. I mean, you wouldn't typically run a balance sheet or a, specific for a specific location. If you do, you probably need to set up a location like as a separate fund or even a separate organization. But your revenue and expenses are going to always be reported separately by location or by division or by program, like I was showing you there. And so that's where the other segments come into play. They don't necessarily need to be balanced like the funds do. All right. So your chart of accounts set up, make sure that you set up the account number, the description, and report group 1. Every account requires that. Report group 2 is optional if you're using the cash flow statement, but only for assets and liabilities. There are 1 or 2 exceptions to that, but for the most part, just set it up for assets and liabilities. It'll work for you there. only for the cash flow statement. Report group 3 is a complete option that's only used to put a code on the account in the database for custom reporting and export. In fund accounting, you'll also select a restriction type. Fund accounting has specialized fund accounting reports called FASB reports. And if you're using the FASB reports, you need to set the restriction type for the specific GL account of how it's going to be reported on those reports here in fund accounting. Restricted, temporary, restricted, or unrestricted. And there's also a statement of functional expenses FASB report. So any accounts that have an expense class, you will also set the expense class down here as well for the statement of functional expenses. That's the only one that that's used for. But the account itself must be set up as an expense of some kind up here in order for this option to be available. Question, does Denali provide sample chart of accounts? By default, no, but Denali does provide a demo company when you install it, and there is a chart of accounts already set up in the demo company. But it may not be what you need for your organization, which is why we don't typically do that by default. So if you need help setting up a chart of accounts, the best option is make sure you consult a CPA or an accountant for your organization to get the chart of accounts set up correctly. And then we can help you have those accounts set up and imported through a conversion process on a new company setup. We can also help you through our customer support team or through training, which is myself or any other trainer that can also help you augment or update or add to your existing chart of accounts if needed, if you're struggling trying to figure out how to do it yourself in the system. But the account setup is all done right here. So anything you set up, when you set up a new account, there are some things that once the account is saved, once you hit save, the account is now in the system. But as long as there's no history posted to it, you can delete that account out of the system if needed. Or at any point in the future, you can edit the account setup. You can edit the description, the class, the report group options at any time in the future if you are a user who is authorized to make changes to the chart of accounts. The only thing you cannot edit here is the number. However, we even have an option to renumber an account, and that's how you would edit the number. But that's not done here on this screen. That's done up here in the menu, the account menu, the renumber GL accounts. That's where you would set that up. Okay, another question. If I add a fund, does it automatically add the accounts to the fund? The answer is no, it doesn't do it automatically, but there is an option in fund accounting. When you do the copy chart of accounts option, you can copy the fund accounts and you can select the source fund from what you're copying from, such as your administration fund. And then your destination fund would be the new fund you just added. And when you click OK, it automatically copies all the accounts to the new fund. You can use the account filter to only copy certain accounts as needed, or do a range of accounts. And so you're not copying all of them. In business accounting, the copy account function does not allow you to go from one division or location to another, but it does allow you to go from one organization to another. So if you set up multiple company files and you want to use the same chart of accounts across the different companies, you can use that function for that. Okay. So once your chart of accounts is set up, then you're ready to start using Denali. The general ledger the only transactions you're going to use in Denali in the general ledger itself directly are journal entries. Now there's some other options like the allocations. The allocations allows you to basically program certain journal entries to allocate amounts from one GL account to multiple other accounts by percent. That can be done through allocations. But basically, it's just simply a journal entry that you're doing there. It's just kind of an automated journal entry that does it for you. So when you go here to enter a journal entry, there's my batch control again. It's going to ask me to open a batch. And then I can go in and fill out my journal entry as needed. Put in the date, a description. Denali assigns a reference number for journal entries, so you can do that. You can use that number, or you can put whatever transaction number you want to use for the reference number. But keep in mind, this is a sequential number by batch and also by transactions within that batch. So that's kind of a security feature. So you can see on the audit trail the sequence that transactions were posted in case the date has changed on any of them. So I recommend leaving that number and using the reference there. Then you fill out your debits and credits, as many lines as you need on your journal entry, as long as the debits and credits equal, as long as they balance. If I got a journal, here's one where I've got 3 lines, but my debits and credits equal, so we're good there. All right, another thing you can do is you can create a reversing entry automatically by checking this box and then putting in the day that you want the entry to be reversed. And then when you post this one entry, it actually posts 2 journal entries. It does the one you entered on the transaction day, and it does an exact reversal of that entry on the reversal day. Pretty simple to do that. Now, if you're crossing funds like I'm doing here, I've got 3 different funds I'm crossing in this entry. So what I have to do before I can post is I have to process the due to do froms for those, because otherwise I'd throw my funds out of balance. So I click this button here, and when I click OK, it automatically processes the due to do from, but it gave me an error. Let's see what that error is. I probably don't have a due to do from set up on one of my funds, or maybe one of my funds is restricted. It says I have unbalanced due to do froms in the current batch is my error. See that on my other screen here. There it is. So let's see what we did there. So if I go back to my journal entry, edit and delete that. So if I debit an expense in the Grants and Fellowships Fund for $500, and I credit cash in my administration fund for $500, I'm basically coding an expense out of cash. Now, when I process due to do from, it inserts an automatic due to do from entry for me. And you'll see that on my edit report here. And there is my entry. Remember, that's just one entry, but it's now got 4 lines on that entry. It's got my original lines I put in, and then it added my due to do from lines automatically for me, so that my funds are all balanced and everything will post the way it should. All right. So there's another question. Can I create a recurring entry? Yes, you can actually create a recurring entry. There's a couple of ways to do that. One way is use the allocation codes to process the recurring entries as allocations. So when I go to my allocation codes in the options menu, I can set up one account that I'm debiting, and then I'm splitting the credit across multiple accounts by dollar amount or percentage. Or I can do the reverse of that. I can credit one account and split the debit across multiple accounts that I'm crediting or that I'm debiting by percentage or by a specific dollar amount. And then once those allocations are set up, they're grouped together by what's called a frequency code. So you would group those allocations by frequency, and those are basically recurring templates that you can process at any time when you're processing journal entries. So you just click this button here and you can select which allocations you need to process. Or alternatively, you can create an entire batch. If I set up a new batch, but I make this a recurring batch, all the journal entries in this recurring batch become one big recurring batch that I can process in one click at any time. And that's done by clicking this button here, Generate Recurring Activity, and there's a recurring batch I already have. When I select which recurring batches I want to process in one click, and I hit Generate, it automatically adds all those journal entries to my current batch to be processed and post through. But the recurring batch is still saved to be processed again at any time in the future. Now, I will say one thing about journal entries. You can go here at any time in the general ledger. This is for all Denali users. This is for business and fund accounting users. You can go into the general ledger and you can enter a journal entry at any time. But there is one rule I give every user that uses Denali. Make sure you follow this rule when entering journal entries. And the rule says this: do not enter journal entries to any control account. Do not make journal entries to your control account. Your control accounts are the balance sheet accounts that specifically track the balances of the other modules. For example, the cash balances for the bank accounts in BankRec, the liability balances for your vendors set up in accounts payable, or the receivable asset balances for the customers set up in receivables. Do not make journal entries to any of those accounts here in the general ledger. And the reason for that is because general ledger is very selfish. It's very stingy. If you make a journal entry to the general ledger, you will not post that entry to the BankRec or accounts payable or any other module. It doesn't talk back to those other modules. It takes everything in from them. When you post a deposit in BankRec or a vendor invoice or payment in accounts payable, those modules will post to general ledger, and it'll take those postings from those other modules, but it won't give anything back. So don't do journal entries to those control accounts. Otherwise, you throw those balances off. Accounts payable doesn't see that journal entry. BankRec doesn't see it. Accounts receivable doesn't see it. So you've just thrown off those balances between the general ledger and the other modules. So be careful with that. There are exceptions to that rule, but that is generally Denali's rule number one. Do not make journal entries to your control account. And we'll talk about those control accounts when we're setting up the other modules later this week. Question, can I change amounts to the recurring entries? Yes, you just have to switch to the recurring batch, and then you can go in and edit those amounts and save them again as needed. Can I allocate utility account to department utility account? Yes, you can with the allocation code. So basically what you do is any amounts that are posted to your utilities general expense as a debit, you're going to set up an allocation to credit that expense account here, and then specify to the specific department utilities expense account the percentage or the specific amount it goes to. Can recurring entries be set up to prevent this? I believe that's what you're saying. And also, can you delete a journal entry if you made a mistake? Couple of questions there. Yes. The users, if they have access to journal entry, they will have access to edit recurring entries. There's no way to block that out. But if you make a mistake when you make a journal entry, you can go in and delete that entry as long as it's not posted yet. Here's the entry that I did, and it already added my do to do from. I can delete that as long as it's not posted yet. Yeah. But once it's posted, the only way to reverse it is to make a new entry that's just an exact reversal of the one you posted to undo your mistake. And then you have to post the reversal as well. Great question. Can the AP control account be blocked for posting with a journal entry? No, it cannot. So that's where you have to make sure you're following rule number 1 when you do journal entries. So I tell everybody, most accounts payable users, they probably shouldn't even have access to doing journal entry. They should have that whole function blocked for that user. They need to put all their entries in through the accounts payable module so that that function, that doesn't happen and it doesn't throw off your balances. All right. So as promised, I told you I'd show you a quick overview of how to set up your financial reports to where you can consolidate all the different expense accounts that are broken out by fund or division or program or department or whatever into a single consolidated report. That is done through the options menu in the general ledger under the advanced report group code. So this is a little bit of a setup, but it only has to be done once. You have to go through and set up a report group code for each line that you're going to generate on the consolidated report. And under that code, you're going to take all the accounts that you want to group together. For example, if I'm doing a consolidated balance sheet and I set up a line called cash, then I'm going to have a report group called cash. Actually, I believe I have one. All cash is what I call it. And so these are all my cash accounts that are across all my different programs and funds. Same with expense accounts. Utilities expense. If you need to have, if you've got 300 utility expense accounts because you've got that many different combinations of funds, programs, divisions, and so forth, you can group them all together in one single line with this advanced report group option. And then once you do that, you're going to create one final group. Also, you're going to tell it to print the group totals. Otherwise, it'll still list them all out and then give you a total for that group. You're going to create one final group that gives you the consolidated report. And so when you're using the advanced report groups, then you can run that final group. I have one here called balance sheet summary, and I get a consolidated balance sheet report across all funds and programs. That warning just says, make sure all your GL accounts are included in this report or it may be out of balance. And it's a consolidated report that shows just a simple structure, a simple single line of all of the assets, all of my groups. So there's my total cash, total accounts receivable, total inventory, and total prepaid expenses for my total assets, and my liabilities that are grouped. And so now I get a single one-page report. And look, I'm out of balance, which means some of my accounts were not included in some of my groups. But I get a single one-page report that gives me everything I need in a simplified consolidated report. Run the same report as detailed, which I've got a separate setup for that. That's where I didn't check the box to just show the totals only. Then this will show me the same report, but now it's going to list out each of the accounts under each group with a total for each group that I set up. This is going to be multiple pages because of that. So here's the cash group, that my own custom advanced report cash group. This is the list of all the accounts, and here's the total for that group. Now my next group is accounts receivable, and then inventory, and so forth. And keep in mind, when you're running these reports, you can still run these separate by fund using your advanced report groupings so that the accounts are still grouped together, but separated out by fund still if needed, or by program, or using the account filter any way you need to separate those out. So for my outreach program, I actually have a filter code set up for that. And now all I'm seeing is, well, I'm not going to get a report here because I don't have any balance sheet accounts for outreach. So that wouldn't even give me a report. I'd have to run the revenue and expense to show that. And yes, that's a good question too. Can I run the budget report using advanced report groups? Absolutely. The balance sheet, revenue and expense, and the budget report can all use the advanced report groups to get you that consolidated report. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? All right, this is the outline for today's class, so we're trying to get everything covered in there. So your budgeting, boy, I don't even have, oh yeah, here it is, budget management right here. Okay, that's where we're at. So your budgeting in Denali, what you use the budgeting for is specifically for the ability to set up your budgets and run reports for your budget. So if I run a budget report for, say, my grants and fellowships fund, then I'm going to print, yeah, the account number is printed. Very good. Get zero budget, so it doesn't give me such a big report. No information. Maybe I don't have a budget for grants and fellowships. All right. Maybe I don't have a budget set up yet. Let's run a combined budget for everything. Let's see what we get. All right, yeah, see, this is what I was trying to avoid, but there we go. I have administration, federal, and my multi-fund, but I don't have grants and fellowships. That's why I was getting that error. Got a loose nut on the controls today, so let's try federal funds. I think administration would be a little more than lines than what I want to illustrate, so, but it's definitely there. You can run it for any of your funds. There we go. That's a little easier to see. So I have budgeted in revenue lines. I also have a revenue adjustment. Of course, my budget for that is zero, but if there were any actuals, I would see that here. And then my expenses, there's my budgeted lines for expenses. Now, of course, this is only the federal fund. And it looks like I haven't established a budget in my budget for some of these accounts. But that's okay, because I don't have any actuals for them yet either. But for the accounts that do have a budget, this report shows the current period, the year-to-date totals, the budget year-to-date, and what is left in the budget year-to-date. If you're over budget, it'll show it in parentheses like a negative number on any line. So if you do need to set up a budget though, then the general ledger has a budget management system that allows you to go in and set up your budget. And when you're setting up your budget, you can do as many different budgets as you need to under different categories so that it simplifies. Oh, that even popped up on my other screen. So it simplifies your budget management. You don't have to dump all your revenues and expenses into one great big massive budget code, but you can. It doesn't hurt to do that. So when you're setting up a new budget code, I'll just say new 5 for this budget code, new budget. And you're setting it up for the current fiscal year. You select which year it is. It's always the beginning of the fiscal year you're going off of. So when I click next, then the system says, what do you want to do? Create a new budget from scratch? I can now pick and choose which accounts using the account filter that I want to include in this budget. If I want to set up a budget for my O1 program, I can say that's my segment 2. I'll just do the O1 accounts and set up a budget only for those accounts. Or if I want to do a specific fund, I'll use segment 3. That's my fund segment, and set up the grants and fellowships budget. Or if I'm doing all accounts, I'll just leave the segment filter out and do one big massive budget for all accounts. I can also copy from a previous budget, like a previous year or another budget I've saved. Or I can import from an external file, an Excel spreadsheet file. It must be in the right format though. So if you're going to use the import, I always recommend setting up a budget with just one account using the start to end range of accounts. Put the same account, one start to end. Set up that budget and then export it first. And that gives you the format you need to import all your other GL accounts that you need to put into a budget. But if I'm starting from scratch, there's even tools to help me with that. So when I set up a new budget, It's asking, do you want to set the budget amounts to 0 and then manually plug those in for each GL line? Or do you want to use last year's or a prior year's actual revenues and expenses to start out with your budget, kind of a starting point for what you want to budget for the new budget that you're doing? And if you do use a prior year's actual numbers, you can also tell the system to, yeah, let's use it, but let's increase those numbers by whatever percentage I want for my New Year's budget. Or I can even decrease those numbers by going down, and then it's a negative for the New Year's budget. So if I just go straight with last year's actuals, when I click finish, the system automatically creates a budget for me based on last year's actual revenues and expenses for each line. But even with that, I can still edit those numbers for the current year, one line at a time. I can still do that. And even with that, I can still tell the system to select a range of accounts. Start here, holding the Shift key down on my keyboard. I can select a range of accounts and then just increase or decrease those amounts by a certain percent on my budget, as you can see there. By default, your budget will be broken out by each period or each month. So you can set up different budgets for each month. And this is based on last year's monthly totals. Or you can say, you know what, that's a little too complex. Let's just do one big massive budget for the whole year. And you just check the annual box for that line to do an annual budget instead of a monthly budget. Any budgets that are 0, or if you do an annual amount and you enter it in on the annual budget, the system will automatically divide that by 12 and split it across your monthly periods for you. But it's still reported as annual unless after you're done entering it, you uncheck the box. It'll still keep your entries, but if you uncheck that box after, it'll now report it on a monthly basis, not an annual basis. But it did the division for you, so you don't have to go through and manually divide out each month. The only time where you would need to manually do each month separate is if your budget varies from month to month, if it's not the same each month on that line for the whole year. Okay, it says, is there a way to run the report for 2 funds, or does it have to be only one or all? Yes, it has to either be one fund or all funds when you're running any reports. But you can also tell it when you're running those financial reports. If you're doing all funds, you can still do a separate report by fund. It just does all of them. But in my case, I've got 4 funds, so I'll get 4 revenue and expense reports when I run this, 4 separate ones, instead of one big final combined report. Okay, one final thing we need to cover before we end today's session is we need to cover how do you do a year-end close in Denali. By the way, the budget tool works for both regular and fund accounting, business and fund accounting. So not all businesses use a budget, but there's a lot that do. So if you need to set up a budget in your business, you can do that with the budget tool. So for year-end close, there's 4 steps you need to take in fund accounting, but there's only 3 steps in business accounting. One of the steps in fund accounting does not apply in business accounting. And any of your other questions about the budget, stay on after we get done and I'll go ahead and get those answered, or any other questions you may have. But go ahead and ask the questions. Go ahead and type in your questions anyway, and I'll get those answered after we're finished here with the year-end close. So to close out the year in the organization, these steps apply to all Denali users. Before you do your year-end close, make sure that all year-end entries and adjustments are completed and posted. All year-end audits and taxes are done. Make sure all of those year-end functions are done before you close out the year in Denali. The question comes up though, well, don't I have to close out the year at year-end? No, you don't. Because remember, our fiscal calendar is a 5-year fiscal calendar. So you can keep the year open for up to 5 years if you need to, while you're getting all of your audits and year-end adjustments done. The system will just continue to work in period 14 and 15 and 16 and so forth until you complete all of your year-end functions for the current year. Once that is done, make sure your year-end financial statements in Denali, specifically your balance sheet, your revenue and expense report or income statement if you're business accounting, and your budget report. Make sure they all line up with your audited financial statements from the auditors and that they all match. Once those match, then you're ready to proceed with the year-end close. So to do the year-end close, the first step you're going to take is you're going to go back to the controller and you're going to run a backup of your organization. Even if you have automatic backups through a cloud system or an automated system, always run the backup here in controller before you do the year-end close. So step one on a year-end close, step one, run a backup. Step two, you're going to come up to the options menu in the controller module, and you're going to use this function called Copy Organization Utility. This right here allows you to create a copy of the current company file that you're about to close. And it pops up on my other screen here. And here's what I recommend. For the company file name, demo organization, whatever your name is, type that in as the company file name, but then add the year that you're closing out at the end for the organization. Your abbreviation, you're going to want to change that here. I recommend using the letters YE for year end and then the year that you're closing out, YE 2019. Now, if you work in multiple organizations in Denali, you might have to kind of reconfigure your copy company files when you're closing out the year for each company because they each have to have their own abbreviation. But what you're doing here is you're creating what's called a history company file. This is your archive of the current year's history that you're about to close out. So this is how you archive the current year before closing it out. And when you click OK, the system makes an exact copy of the current company file as it is. Now, even if you've got 6 months of history into year 2, or even 2 years of history into years 3 and 4, it'll copy that too, but that's what's important is you're making a copy of what's in current year before it's closed out. So you can ignore the other data that's there past the current year. And it just does it automatically for you. This copy company will copy the entire database for every module, not just general ledger. It does the entire company database for all modules. So whatever modules you have, this one copy company will take care of it for you. So it's not necessary to do an archive company for all the other modules because this one here will do it for you. So recap, step one, we're going to run a backup. Step two, we're going to do our copy company for our archive, our history. Then we're ready to proceed to step three. For step three, you must exit out of all other Denali modules, and all other users must completely exit out of Denali. And then you're going to come into the general ledger only, leave that one open, but exit out of everything else. And if you're fund accounting, you will proceed on to step three. But if you're not fund accounting, you're going to skip step three. Step three does not apply to business accounting. And what you're going to do for step three is you're going to go up to year end and you're going to close the fund year. And it's telling me I can't close the fund year because other modules are open right now. But when you do that fund close, you have to close out each and every fund one at a time. And what Denali does when you do that is it takes all of the revenue and expenses for that year and closes them out, zeroes them out, and it posts the excess revenue or deficit to your unreserved for encumbrance account for the fund automatically. So that's the year-end close for the fund, but you have to do it separate by fund in fund accounting. So step 3, you'll close the fund year. Once you've closed out each and every fund and all of them are done, then you'll proceed to step 4. Step 4 is also in the year-end menu. You're just simply going to close the organization. And the only thing that does in fund accounting is that just rolls your fiscal calendar to the next year, because all of your revenues and expenses are already closed out at that point. And that completes the year-end process. Now for business accounting, I'll switch over to that real quick. For business accounting, there is no fund to close. So all you're going to do for step 3 is close the year, period. When you do that, it's going to ask you, what is the retained earnings account for your business? Now there's your big warning there. You get that in fund accounting too. Since there's no fund set up to designate a retained earnings account like the unreserved for encumbrance, you have to specify that at year end in the business account. So you can enter the account number, or if you double click, it brings up your equity account and you select the one that you have chosen as retained earnings. And then when you click OK, Denali will close out all of your income and expense accounts, reset those, and post the net income to this retained earnings account at year end. Or if you had a loss that year, it'll post the loss as a debit to the retained earnings, reducing that retained earnings balance. And then it automatically rolls the fiscal calendar for you in one step. You don't have to do that step 4 to roll the fiscal calendar with business accounting. It does it for you automatically. But you don't have to close out each fund in business accounting because there are no funds. You just have a single chart of accounts set up in the business accounting without designation of the different funds. Okay, so that completes our outline for today. So let's see what questions I can get answered in the next 10 minutes before I have to log off and jump on to my next appointment, guys. All right, so let's back up a little bit here. So a question here, is there a way to run the report for only 2 funds? I believe I answered that one. So the next one, could you use the advanced reports to combine 2 funds for reporting? You can actually, yes. Remember in advanced reports, when you're setting up those accounts, you group all the accounts together for a single account, like a utilities expense or all cash or whatever you want to group those together. And then you can still run those reports separate by fund or combined as a single report, and it's still consolidated into a single line entry, but the totals will only include what you put into the account filter. So if I want to run the advanced consolidated report for all funds, but only for my outreach by program 01, I can do that as well. And it still just gives me that same report with the total utilities, but only for the program 01, or for just one specific fund with total utilities. So you can definitely do that. So when you're running those reports, let me show you that real quick. I'm in the business accounting, that works the same. Advanced report groups right here. So I can do my report group, my total consolidated report, but I can still use my account filter to specify what numbers are going to show up on that report. And in fund accounting, reports, revenue and expense, I can still use the advanced report groups, put in my revenue and expense group. Oh, I don't have it set up yet, so can't show you that. But I can still specify a specific fund for that instead of doing all funds, just the total for all funds. Or I can do it under separate funds as well. Do all funds, but a separate report for all funds. How do you delete a line in the budget? It's real simple. You just simply right mouse click on the line in the budget itself and delete that line. Real easy to do. You have to edit first. Just show the current year. Oh boy, this is an old budget. Let me find a current budget. 2020, there we go. So now I just simply right mouse click the line and delete the account, and it's gone. Will the archived copy do payroll and accounts payable? Yes, it does all modules. That is correct. If we are unsure if our previous bookkeeper closed 2019, how can we easily check? That is real simple to do. You just simply go to the controller module, bring up your fiscal calendar, and see if the current year still shows 2019 like mine does. That means it has not been closed yet. If it's closed, the current year would be 2020. Year 2 would then be 2021. Year 3 would 2022, and so forth. And of course, it adds another year. This would be 2024 on year 5. What if you haven't closed the year for 5 years? Good question. Denali will continue to work for up to 5 years, but at the end of your fiscal calendar, if you still haven't closed the year by 2023, in my case, then it stops at that point. You cannot go any further. You have to close the year by then. When you try to make journal entries, it'll say the date is invalid or it's outside your fiscal calendar range. When you try to make any transactions in any module, you'll get that error. Can you show journal entries for business? Yes, that's real simple. You go in here, again, you're in multi-batch mode, so you select your batch, and there's your journal entry for business. So you don't have any of the fund accounting functionality in here, but it's very similar. You don't have the encumbrance lines or anything like that, but it's just a simple debit and credit that you can do there. Cash on hand, we're going to credit, debit and expense account, administrative salaries, that's good enough. We just put in the amount. And there's your journal entry. But rule number 1 still applies. No journal entries to your control account, even in business accounting. Can I consolidate 2 companies into one set of reports? Good question. In business accounting, yes, that is an option where you can run a report that shows consolidated totals. Under the reports menu, there's the option to do consolidated ledgers. But if you do that, make sure that both companies or multiple companies, you can do as many as you want, not just 2. But if you need to consolidate multiple companies into a single financial statement, make sure that all the companies you're consolidating have the same chart of account structure. You cannot consolidate companies that have a different structure on the account segment setup. They all have to be identical on the account segment setup to do that consolidation. Can I export any report to Excel? Some reports export really well to Excel using the CSV option, such as the audit trail. If I run an audit trail report, I can use the CSV option and it saves that as a comma-separated value file, a CSV, comma delimited, which works really nice in Excel. But all reports have the option to do what's called an Excel using the text file, but this one's not so workable in Excel. This just basically takes what you see on the actual report and it tries to overlay it onto a spreadsheet, and it doesn't work too well. So the CSV option is what you want to use for Excel, but not all reports have that CSV option in Denali, but a lot of them do. So that's the one you'll use there. If I make a journal entry for payroll and the journal entry credits cash, you said that wouldn't go to the bank rec module. Is that accurate? What if I do a journal entry for revenue that comes in via outside credit card vendor? Okay, so yes, that is accurate. If you make a journal entry to the cash account, bank rec won't see that account. Your revenue accounts, though, those right there are not control accounts. Those are not the balances of what's in the other modules, but the other side of that entry probably is. Like if you had a revenue coming in that went into the bank, your journal entry would typically credit the revenue and debit the cash for that. But keep in mind that if you do that as a journal entry, bank rec doesn't see that entry. So when you're reconciling the bank statement, you'll see that deposit on your bank statement, but you won't see it in Denali, in the bank rec module. So you won't be able to reconcile. So instead of doing that as a journal entry, you're just simply going to go into bank rec and make a bank deposit for that revenue and just code it to the right revenue or revenues. It can be split across as many different revenues as you need to when making the bank deposit. And we'll cover how to do that on the bank rec training tomorrow. So be sure to tune in tomorrow And I'll show you how to enter those entries correctly rather than doing journal entries. What is the implication of closing the year but not the organization? If you close the fund but not the organization, then your fiscal calendar won't roll to the next year. So you need to make sure that you close out the organization after all your funds are closed out to get that fiscal calendar to roll. Now, if you're not using fund accounting, that doesn't apply. When you close out the organization, it automatically rolls the fiscal calendar in business accounting. So you don't have to worry about the funds in business accounting. How can you access your archived or copied information for details? Good question. You can go back to the controller, and when you click on the Setup Select Organization, you're going to see your company listed at the bottom if your code starts with a letter that's down further in the alphabet than any other company codes in there, which is why I recommend the YE. So unless you are like Zebra Incorporated, then the YE should put it at the bottom of the list. And then the year will number them in numeric sequence by year in addition to that. And you just select the company you want to log into, the year-end archive company, and select that. It'll switch over to that company. And then you can have access to that. So how do you post a journal entry? Posting a journal entry is just simply hitting the button here that says Post Journal Activity once you've entered it. You enter the journal entry. If you have any allocations to process, you can do those or skip that. Run your edit report and then post. And that will go ahead and post the entire batch. It posts all the entries in that current batch that you're in when you hit that post button. If you're not using due to, due from, and you have to transfer, say, an expense entry from one fund to another, how do you keep your funds balanced? That's a good question. Due to, due from will do that for you automatically, but if you're not using due to, due from, you must include manually in your journal entry. When you're entering the journal entry, all the lines needed to do that. So if I'm going to transfer an expense out of administration, I'm going to credit that expense, $50, and I'm going to transfer it to grants and fellowships, for example, $50. My debits and credits equal, but if I haven't balanced my funds in my journal entry, it's going to give me an error if my funds are restricted. So instead, I have to put in my due to, due from manually as part of my journal entry. And you can determine which accounts that you're coding the due to, due from to if you need to. So now my funds are balanced. Not only is my entry balanced, but my fund is also balanced. And it doesn't have to go to these due to, due from accounts when you're doing it manually that I have set up here. You can choose what part of the administration fund or whatever fund gets the debit for the credit for the expense coming out of that fund. You have to have a debit somewhere. Maybe it's just the cash. Maybe we're just transferring the cash balance as part of that. So it would look like that in that case. So now I'm taking the cash I have in the bank and putting it back in administration, taking it out of grants and fellowships because that was a grants and fellowships expense, which is where it's coded to. Now, I know the question pops up, well, wait a minute, Jeremy, isn't that rule number 1? No journal entries to control accounts? In fund accounting, these two lines are the exact same account. So we're not actually changing the balance here to our cash and bank account. It's two different funds, but it's the same account. So it's not going to throw my cash balance off. So this is perfectly fine to do a journal entry. That is one of those exceptions I mentioned with rule number 1. So you can always do it that way to run it manually rather than have the system automate the due to, due from. All right, next question. Should I create the payroll entry as an AP entry? If you're not using Denali payroll, you could. That's a great way to do it. That way everything flows the way it needs to. or just do it directly in the bank reconciliation as a bank rec entry for the cash deducted out of payroll. That would be another option. But if your payroll entry involves a control account, then I would probably set up a separate clearing account for the control account side of that if I was to do it as a journal entry. And then when I go into bank rec to make that entry, the deduction out of cash, I can just have the other side of it hit that clearing account to offset what my payroll entry was as a journal entry. That way you're not breaking rule number 1. So that's a really good way to do payroll entries if you don't use Denali's payroll module, if you have an outside payroll service that does your payroll for you. Can I reopen a closed year to correct an entry? You know what, that is a great question, and I'm glad you asked that. The answer is no. So please do not close the year until you're ready. Make sure that your audited financial statements match what Denali says for their financial statements before you close the year. Any adjustments after that have to be made in the following year, like as a balance forward adjustment dated the first day of the next fiscal year. And if the mistake was done by the auditor, then that's the only way you're going to be able to explain it, because once that year is closed, it's a done deal. You cannot reopen it. For federal funds, the uniform guidance has various ways to apply IDC costs to the various funds as a percentage of payroll, modified total costs, so forth. Do you have a recommendation on how to set this up? GMS automatically does this. And as a BP, I find this battle, a business partner. Good question. You know what, that's probably a conversation we would probably need to have one-on-one. That's a little more detailed than what I could probably cover in this class today. So send me an email and I'll make sure we get you scheduled for an appointment that I can go over that with you. But you could probably set that up depending on what's needed exactly to make that happen. If we start the DMO fund at close archive to fiscal year 2019, close year and organization, in fiscal year 2020, I am still accessing the DMO fund company. The DMO fund company is just a demonstration company for the Denali system for you to go in and practice and play in. It's not your company file. So if you do a close in DMO, it doesn't close out your company. Each company has to be closed out separately for the year-end close. Make sure that you do that. The next question is there a budget template we can download and then use the template to import a budget? The best way to get that download template is, like I was saying, go in and create a budget in Denali with just one GL account, one of your revenue or expense accounts, and then use the export feature in the budget management, and now you've got your template. If you have an asset from one department that is selling an item, how would you post the item and payment? If you have an asset from one department that is selling an item, like selling a fixed asset, is that what you mean on that? I'll need a little more clarification on that one, I guess. So the next question is, can you close year-end out of order like 2018 before 2016? Good question. The answer is no. You cannot close year-end out of order. Each year has to be closed in sequence. Okay, clarification. Selling tires and rims and the tires from a vehicle. Still need to know a little more about it. If it's something you normally sell, that would just come out of inventory. That would be done through the sales module. But if it's like a fixed asset that you're just disposing of and selling it, selling it is how you're getting rid of it, then you would probably just put that in as a bank deposit for the money you received from the sale and code it to the fixed asset or to whatever GL account that it's going to credit for that to get it off the books. You could do it as a journal entry as long as you're not hitting a control account. So that's the key. let me know. I can be a little more, I can work with you a little closer on that, Colleen, to give you a better response, just one-on-one between you and me. So I'll get back with you on that one. Okay, well, we went over a little bit today. I apologize for that. There was just too much to cover to try to cram it into a 2-hour session. So, but I do thank you guys for sticking around. And any of you who were not able to stick around, tell your friends that had to leave early if any of them had to go. And I'll send out follow-up emails as well to make sure that you get the follow-up on this. And then we can, hang on just a sec here, give you access to the recording as well. That's the plan. So this is my current contact information. If you want to speak to me, you will need to schedule an appointment. You can do that through our customer service phone line, or you can send me an email. The email address is training@cougarmountain.com. So go ahead and send out your emails with any additional questions you have, and I'll be sure to get those questions answered for you within the next few days. If you want to schedule an appointment with me, absolutely. Just call the customer phone line and they'll get you scheduled in. And that completes today's training. So tomorrow we will be doing the bank reconciliation and accounts payable training. So make sure those of you who haven't registered for tomorrow's session, contact your account representative here at Cougar Mountain to get you registered for that if you need to have those modules set up for. For those who are registered and those who will be registered, I look forward to seeing you there. And thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure working with you folks today. Appreciate that, and have a great day, everyone. See you tomorrow.